You mentioned Sean Parker. Talk a little bit about his lobbying effort in this area. It seems to have gone back nearly 10 years at this point. Obviously, of Napster and Facebook fame, as you mentioned, played by Justin Timberlake in The Social Network. That's the number one thing that comes to mind for me. So, how did his lobbying effort begin, and how did it gain some traction?
Well, as I said, like a lot of Silicon Valley, successful Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, he thinks that because he did a few things well, he has a better idea for everything. And I think he is public spirited in the sense that he's spending a lot of money on cancer research and stuff like that. So he saw this problem that communities need money, his friends have money. How do we get his friends to put money into these areas? But unlike some of the other Silicon Valley guys, Mark Zuckerberg stands out. He was smart enough not to show up in Washington and say, here, I'm going to fix this. Here's the plan. He very cleverly created a little think tank, the Economic Innovation Group, and hired two young Washington insiders, a Democrat, Steve Glickman, a Republican, John Lettieri, both of whom had, among other things, worked in the Senate. And they spent a couple of years in stealth mode building the case that geographic inequality was a problem in America. As you know, we've long been talked about income inequality, the difference between the poor and the rich and the middle class and the rich. But if you look at what happens at the community level, increasingly, we had a period of time where regions of the country tended to converge in terms of median income, and now they're spreading apart. People are moving less often than they used to. So they helped build the case that we needed to deal with geographic inequality, and that leads to place-based policies. So after a couple of years of fertilizing this ground, they say, just what? We have a solution, and out pops opportunity zones. And it was very popular with members of Congress of both parties, I think for a couple of reasons. One is the simple talking points sounded pretty good, and the members of Congress weren't looking at the details. They were more into getting money into my district as opposed to giving a tax break for the rich people who do. Secondly, Sean Parker is very charming, and he spent a lot of time talking to members of Congress and campaign contributions as well. And so the initial bill was pretty bipartisan, and their real coup was getting two prime sponsors in the Senate, Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina, and Cory Booker, Republican, Democrat from New Jersey. They had like the perfect diversified portfolio. Like everybody else in Washington, they thought Hillary Clinton would win. Cory Booker would be their point person and defend them against the charge that this was just a way to cut taxes for rich people. Cory Booker, as mayor of Newark, was very much into providing tax incentives for business to invest in Newark. Well, Donald Trump won. Tim Scott turned out to be pivotal to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and managed to get this into the bill with very little notice, no hearings, not much scrutiny from outsiders. And that's one of the things that I find most troubling. I'm all for for Sean Parker coming up with good ideas. I just don't think that Sean Parker and the people he hires, the technicians, former congressional staffers and lawyers and lobbyists, should actually be writing the provisions that we end up in the tax code. And that's largely what happened here.
Well, this happens more than people realize, that
Right.
basically these interest groups and lobbying organizations, they write the tax code. It gets copy and pasted, and particularly with Republican legislators. But Cory
That's
Booker,
right.
Cory Booker being instrumental to this is really interesting to me because it tracks much with his tenure as mayor of Newark. This was very much in the vein of the kinds of stuff that he was interested in, implemented, and also got a little bit in trouble for with, there were some corruption investigations into his close allies due to privatization
Right.
of
One thing
water.
that I think that happened in Newark was that they did get some money from some legislation passed that provided tax incentives for businesses to invest in Newark. But almost all the land that was involved was city owned. So the city could decide whether to sell it for this purpose or not. Now, that may have been, I don't know anything about any corruption, but the city had some role in that. But in opportunity zones in general, there's no role for local government except local zoning. People come in, they build a building, the local government may not even know if it's getting the tax break. There are some exceptions. In the District of Columbia, if you're a district resident and you're investing in a district opportunity zone project, you only get the district level capital gains break on your taxes if the project has been blessed by the city authorities, but that's unusual.
Gotcha. And then, so this was through the reconciliation process in the Trump tax code. So it was the Cory Booker input was basically left out, and then Tim Scott just copy and paste.
Exactly. So what happened is the Democrats get totally frozen out of the process of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Tim Scott gets it in the bill, and he gets a little assist from Donald Trump in an interesting way. The Trump White House was initially not particularly interested in this, although there were some fans of opportunity zones in the administration. They were much more focused on cutting corporate taxes. After Trump's unfortunate remarks at Charlottesville, there are fine people on both sides. Tim Scott, who's an African American, went very public and said, "This is outrageous what the president did. We need more moral leadership from the White House." The president invited him to the White House. Scott tells me, and he writes in his autobiography, that he expected a confrontation with Trump, but Trump mostly listened as Tim Scott explained why these words were so hurtful. And then at the end of the conversation says to Tim Scott, "What can I do to make it up to the people I've offended?" And Tim Scott is ready for that and says, "You can endorse my opportunity zone legislation." The next day on Air Force One, reporters asked the president about his meeting with Senator Scott. And the president said it went very well, and I'm in favor of whatever this thing is he wants to do. And that's when the White House became a supporter. There's a guy named Jerome Smith, who was a low-level White House aide who had been on the Hill and was a fan of opportunity zones. And he tells me that after the president met with Tim Scott, his phone rang, and it was the chief lobbyist for the White House, Mark Short, saying, "This opportunity zone thing that you keep talking about, which now part of our priority list, and what is it again?" And so that gave it the Trump push. Later, actually, Trump totally took credit for it. For better or worse, it got branded as a Trump tax cut. Opponents of the thing immediately figured it must be a real estate scam because Trump was involved, and accused the president and his son-in-law of doing it. I think that's not the case. I think that if you do something that's friendly to real estate, turns out a lot of Trump people, including Jared Kushner, take advantage of it. But then the president did something which rather cynical, which is every time someone asked him about what he was doing for African Americans, he would mention opportunity zones. And he hired a couple of black people to be promoters of opportunity zones in the White House. And so it became the kind of all-purpose answer to what he was doing for Tim Scott's community.
He said it's an opportunity for you now to be in my White House. Opportunity. I'm an opportunity zone in and of myself. You mentioned Kushner and Trump, obviously. I mean, this is like their dream too, right? I mean, one, it's a transactional way for him to, I guess, bury the Charlottesville controversy that he stirred up. That's the only way he kind of knew how to do things. And two, this is their language, right? It's
exactly.
Exploiting the tax code for real estate. Right.
So I think that if you can imagine this, I don't know this, but you can imagine when Tim Scott outlined this to the president got it right away. When it comes to tax breaks that real estate people can take advantage of, I don't think the president needed a briefing book to explain it. So I think that's absolutely right. And when I started the project, I went to an Opportunity Zone Expo at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, which, if you've read the book, my jaw dropped. It was like a 21st century gold rush, because there is a whole industry of people, many of them in real estate, who exist to figure out what new goodie has Congress given us that we can use to save money for our clients.